Hi, welcome to the Leadership Podcast that we're doing. And really thrilled to have our guest today. It's Dr. Julie Ponesse. I pronounced that right? Yep. And Julie has a PhD in philosophy from Western back in 2008, with areas of specialization in ethics and ancient philosophy. She has a master's in philosophy with a collaborative specialization in bioethics from the University of Toronto and a diploma in ethics from the Kennedy Institute of Ethics at Georgetown University. Dr. Ponesse has also published in the areas of ancient philosophy, ethical theory, and applied ethics, and has taught at universities in Canada and the US for over 20 years. In the fall of 2021, Dr. Ponesse saw her academic career of 20 years fall apart after she refused to comply with the Canadian University's COVID vaccine mandate. And in response, Dr. Ponesse recorded a special video, which really was about this experience. And then the video went viral. And since then, since the release of the video, Dr. Ponesse has joined the Democracy Fund as the ethics scholar, focusing on educating the public on civil liberties. Dr. Ponesse, what a joy. Welcome. I'm so delighted to have this time with you today.
Thank you so very much.
Yeah. My first question is this. If you were to go back in time last year, because I think it was around the end of August or early September when it came out, what would you have done differently?
Well, I mean, there is a temptation to say that I could have done things differently to avoid the situation that happened. I could have kept my job. I could have complied with the mandates. I could have maybe engaged in some fancier footwork as others have done in order to avoid complying with the mandate, but also not be terminated as well. I could have chosen not to record a video. I mean, hindsight, we talk in moral philosophy a lot about hindsight because you're thinking always hypothetically about what the ideal action is, what the ideal moral agent character is. And so whether you're thinking about that in the future or the past tense, it's all for the sake of trying to improve yourself and better yourself. And, you know, to be honest, I mean, it's been a horrendous 8 months or whatever it's been, and 2 years for all of us outside of that. But I wouldn't, honestly, I wouldn't change anything. It's given me some gifts that I couldn't have imagined, that I could never have foreseen and therefore chosen. I think one thing it did is it freed me from what I now see as a very toxic post-secondary educational and academic environment. And that is something that I think has been developing, brewing for much longer than the last 2 years. I think what we're seeing is now the sort of the climax of a symptom, the causes of which have been building for many years, if not many decades. So I feel that I'm free of that, and being outside of it, you're able to get some distance and to look at it more closely. And, you know, teaching, and my experience teaching in the classroom has evolved significantly since I started about 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, when I started teaching, I was actually quite close in age to the students I was teaching, maybe just 2 or 3 years apart, because I was a grad student teacher. And so they were much more like me. Their educational background was more similar to my own. And that's one in which you were, I mean, we weren't relativists. There were right and wrong answers to certain kinds of questions, but also curiosity and inquisitiveness and wonder and respect and fairness. So all these virtues that we don't necessarily think of as being intellectual virtues, but virtues, you know, like respect and tolerance and patience that support the pursuit of knowledge are so important. They were part of my education, but they've really just gradually been eroded in the university context to the point now where academics are really ideologues. I mean, we've gotten to the point where we figure out what the what the idea, what the narrative has to be, and then work backwards to build up you know, a nomenclature, a body of work that supports that narrative. And dissenting voices are not, they're not common, they're not welcome, they're not encouraged, they are shamed and penalized in the way that schoolyard bullies penalize each other. You know?
Wow. What do you think has caused this? Is it coming from how we're raising children? Is it coming from our public school system, or is it just or is it coming from the university and colleges themselves?
Yeah, I think it's not, I mean, that might be a false dichotomy, right? To say, is it coming from the way parents are raising children, or is it coming from the school system? I think there have been broader cultural moves away from a sense of solidity and meaning and identity towards, in academia, we've talked for a long time about this kind of postmodern free fall in which we've, you know, decided that the things that gave meaning, the worldviews that gave meaning at one point, whether we're talking about Christianity or even Marxism or utilitarianism, don't have meaning anymore. And if that's true, it leaves a kind of vacuum in its place where people are struggling to find a source of meaning. If it isn't religion, if it isn't a dominant philosophical view, what is it? And I think what has stepped in its place is what we've seen in the form of the mantras that have gone all through the COVID response, which is, you know, we're all in this together, trust the expert, follow the science. And these are ways of showing that what matters is not yourself and your identity and your personal integrity, but your functionality in terms of the flourishing of a group. And if you are no longer useful to that group on a certain view, right? Because it isn't clear to me that being an individual and having reason and exercising reason and having integrity, that in my view is the ultimate democratic virtue. That is what makes us useful to other people.
Yeah.
But we've somehow decided that uniqueness is a threat to what's really important, which is the health and flourishing of a group of people, this kind of tribe, this mob mentality. And so I think when you have that overarching view, culturally, wherever that came from, right, then that's going to filter into every level of society, whether we're talking about the governing bodies in law and medicine, whether we're talking about church ideology, or we're talking about how children, I mean, now we're seeing the race educational programs getting rolled out into elementary schools. And so I think there's a real loss, kind of an untethering from who we were, what we were doing in life, what mattered, now to this idea that every bit of ourselves that's different, that's anomalous, that's questioning, which is a form of difference, because you're stepping back and you're critically evaluating what's going on. Say, well, hold on now. I see that all of you believe this one thing, whether it's that COVID is the worst thing that's ever happened to us or whatever it is, right? All of you believe this one thing, but I'd like to pause for a minute and ask whether that's true, which means you're entertaining the possibility that it might not be true, which means you're putting yourself in a position where you might be a dissenter. You might be an outlier. You might be about to step outside of the group. And we somehow collectively, psychologically have gotten to the point where we understand as a tribe member how to punish those potential outliers in the worst possible way. And I think we have seen that there are very few people who are willing to put themselves in that position, and they will say so. I talk to people, you know, on the phone and through email and whether it's social media comments, and they will often say things like, I know X is wrong, but I don't have the courage to do anything about it. And I think, I mean, that is a step. That's what we call in moral philosophy a kind of acrasia or weakness of will. You know what the right thing to do is, but somehow, for some reason, you don't do it. And so this kind of weakness of will is paralyzing us, I think. And it's not irrational, because we see what happens to people who question the narrative, right?
Yeah, and we saw what happened to you. You know, really, it was almost a shaming and you were let go, you lost your job. Were you surprised by the response of that video and your actions? And what responses to the video surprised you in both a good and maybe a not so good way?
If it had happened, if that had happened a year ago, I would have been incredibly surprised. But by the time the school year was starting last September, by the time I recorded the video, by the time I started having interactions with my colleagues in the philosophy department and the administration at Huron and at Western, it was becoming clear that something very odd was going on. And so, I mean, it took about, I don't know, by the time I started writing to my administration with concerns about the COVID policy to the point when I received my termination letter, it was probably about a month, maybe not quite a month. So I had a little bit of time and my intuition started kicking in. And you could tell pretty quickly that the way academics were conversing with one another, and it was all very anomalous with respect to what had happened before, right? There was no longer an atmosphere of tolerance or curiosity. You might expect someone, you might expect an academic to say, that's really interesting. That's not what I've been thinking, but tell me what you think. Lay your work before me and let's have a conversation about it. Let's work on it. We're not seeing that anywhere. We're not seeing it in academia. We're not seeing it in journalism. We're not seeing it with our arrogant government officials. It's absent from society right now, except in very small pockets. Right?
Yeah. Well, so what do we need to do to turn that around? Because it is absent in so many areas, and this idea of shaming people and dismissing people, and the cancel culture that's developed over the past several years. What do we need to maybe look at that and turn that around? Where does it come from? Is it a grassroots movement, or is it going to come from above? Because I don't see it coming from above.
No, because I think it's a trickle down problem that we're in right now.
Yeah.
I think. But I think we're at a precipice, a very, very critical. I mean, by that, I mean, this month we're at a precipice. You can see in terms of what's going on in the world, people's questioning and sort of inklings about some problems with the climate narrative. You see what's going on with the farmers in the Netherlands. You see, I mean, we have political assassinations. We have this gender crisis. We have the sort of the cultural response to the overturning of Roe versus Wade. I mean, we're starting also to see, I think, some very interesting movement in what I would call the middle 30% of people who have gone along with the narrative, but not wholeheartedly. And I think there's a lot of internal juggling going on right now. And it's interesting. I had the chance to speak with Robert Kennedy a while ago, and he said, nobody ever goes from being anti-narrative to pro-narrative. It's always the other way. The stream always flows towards the questioning side. Once people start to have questions, they start to gradually wake up and realize that this narrative view of the world is very, there are inconsistencies. And even if there aren't, or even if you can reason away some of those inconsistencies, the way that the dissenters are treated is very concerning. And that's starting, I think, to reveal to them some problems. We've got, we're starting to have data coming out about the risk of hospitalization and vaccine adverse events. And it's all, undeniably with colored, colored graphs and pie charts, and, that I think are easy for people to process, showing that the more vaccinated someone is, the worse they're going to fare when it comes to COVID. And I think it's getting harder and harder to deny that. There are, they talk about 30, that there's been sort of 30% of the people anti-narrative. I don't think there's been a 30%. I think it's been more like maybe a 5% chunk, and that's been growing a little bit. But then there's sort of 30 on the other side that are just hard-nosed pro-narrative and will never abdicate that position, right? And as we see the government change and morph the narrative, they will just go with it to their graves, right? Yeah. But then there's this interesting middle bunch. And I was actually just talking with someone this morning who worked in a long-term care facility. And she said, yeah, people are just really, they have a very different view of the world than they did 6 months ago. So all of that is to say that something is going on. I think culturally, there's a shift. There's what we often call a paradigm shift away from allegiance to a particular view of the world to something else, whatever that is going to be. And, I was talking to Matthias Desmond a while ago, and he said, the only thing that ever stops the complete full expression of totalitarianism into its worst forms is the slow, persistent, questioning voice, however small, however much of a minority it is. So, doing what I do, I'm frequently ridiculed and I'm called the worst names in the book. And sometimes you feel like it's useless. But I think when we look historically, you get enough people like me together and you keep working away at it and you keep chipping away at the narrative and you keep asking people questions. And the hope is that will, and that's not to say that that's because I'm right about things,
Mm-hmm.
but because it's important for human beings to be free to call a spade, to be free to ask questions when something doesn't feel right. And as soon as we preclude that possibility, we've gotten ourselves to a very worrisome place in terms of where we're going as a collective group.
Yeah, it's almost like, when I was growing up, I was told to be seen and not heard, right?
Right.
And I
Right.
look back on that advice, and I do teaching and coaching and podcasts and radio shows for a living, and it's like I would have gone broke, so
If you
I
did
took that advice. I
that.
I had a conversation just earlier this morning with a colleague of mine, and I do work with youth entrepreneurs, so teaching and coaching. And she's written a book on youth issues. And one thing that we're not teaching youth to do is to think critically and to ask questions. And I remember when I took my coaching course, I was just alluding to this with her this morning. I said, you might want to look at the learner judger model by Dr. Marilee Goldberg Adams. And it's a way of questioning. And you can question in a judger model, which is, okay, who's to blame here, or what's wrong with this situation, who's at fault? Or you can be open-minded and use the learner methodology, which is a curiosity, get curious.
That's a non-rhetorical question, right?
Yeah.
You're actually asking a question you don't believe you have the answer to.
Right. So, yeah. So in terms of, we need to, I guess what I'd like to see happen, and tell me your thoughts too, is just this more of an openness rather than a, no, it's this way and that's it. And if not, you're this, and you're put into a box and ignored.
I think that the advent of the internet and then social media in particular has been an awfully big thing for humans to grapple with mentally, to figure out how to give it its proper place in our lives, to figure out how to, filter the information that we get from it. And it isn't surprising to me that, I think in some sense, people who are my age or your age have the great benefit of coming to maturity before really the internet invaded our lives. But young people today, people that are, anybody who's in university, who's of university, typical university age, probably was on tablets when they were in kindergarten of some sort, or playing video game, so I think it's a very different thing when the formative years of your life are molded by something as vast and complicated and multifarious as the internet. And I think it's allowed us to make a few very big missteps. And we need to figure out how we're going to manage this moving forward. We need to figure out, it's an incredibly overwhelming thing. And, the thing I don't talk to many young people right now, in some sense, not being in the university context anymore, but whenever I do, or whenever I talk to their parents or other adults in their lives, I hear the same thing over and over again. It's stresses that come from social media.
Yeah.
That's what seems to plague them. And not multiple problems. One is just understanding a division between a virtual reality and a non, I won't say real, but I'll say a non-virtual reality. And where does one stop and where does the next one start, and figuring out which one has more value and which one are we going to live our lives according to, figuring all of that out. Trying to figure out how, I mean, it probably used to be the case that unless someone whispered in our ear or we caught a note being passed in class, we wouldn't know all the terrible things that other people say about us. But now we do. Like now I can just look up in my Twitter feed, or I can, go to the CBC article and I can see all the things, all the terrible things people say about me. And that's a lot to grapple with. My favorite ancient philosopher is Aristotle, and in his book, The Nicomachean Ethics, he was talking early on about how we figure out what the good life is, and he kind of goes through the different options that the Greeks had. And one option was that, well, it's really about reputation. I mean, a good life is one in which you're thought well of by other people, and he dismisses that very quickly and very easily, because he says the problem with that is it's resting your everything that matters in your life on something that's totally beyond your control. And
Outside of
that is such a
us.
foolish, oh, pardon me,
It's outside of us.
outside of us. He calls
Yeah.
it an external good, right? It's good. I mean, if you do have the reputation of other people, especially those that you think well of or whose opinion matters, that's a wonderful thing. It can catapult you to success. It can make you less lonely. It can make you feel good about yourselves, all of these things. But if we don't have it, it's a loss. But we have to put that into perspective in some sense. And so whatever matters to our life, we have to make sure we're not resting it purely on what other people think about us. And this is what's wrong, in my view, with an overemphasis of the importance of celebrity, of influencers, of anything that creates value in your life solely based on the opinion of another person. So this is really, I mean, parents, I think, really have to prioritize what's going on in their lives. I mean, I'm a parent and I can say this, and looking ahead, I worry about this tremendously, but I think we have to be very aware of how we're going to introduce our children to this virtual reality, and to give them, can't keep them away from it forever, but we can try to give them skills to help them navigate it and to understand
Well, we just,
what value it can be for us. Oh,
yeah,
unstable.
you're
Um,
pausing a bit.
I was just going to say that the internet is a tool, and a tool is something that's used for our purposes, for our ends, not the other way around. So we shouldn't feel like we're a slave to it and sacrifice ourselves to it.
Yeah, I think there needs to be more balance. And, the people I'm talking to in my community, one woman teaches laughter yoga, and that's all about laughter and connection and mindfulness training, and especially for kids, and connecting with nature. I think we need to really balance it all off. It's almost like that pendulum just has swung so far left, and we need to bring it back a bit, and have conversations and storytelling and adventure, and as you alluded to earlier, wonder, and bring wonder back into the classroom.
And the thing about, I mean, I think it's not surprising that the internet has killed wonder, because now when people have a conversation and they wonder about something, they say, I wonder what coq au vin is. I wonder how they measured the height of the pyramids. I wonder how far it is to Mexico City. Well, you kill that state of wonder as soon as you find out the answer, right? You can find out the answer to any of those questions and many more on the internet. And so I think instant satisfaction of questioning has been billed as an unquestionably good thing. But it's very interesting when you read, the history of science, and you read about people like Galileo and Newton and Copernicus and Einstein, and you read about, these protracted states of curiosity and wonder, frustration, having a question to which you don't have the answer in an immediate
Sure.
sense.
Yeah.
But it's that kind of uncertainty. It's that lack of being in that discomfort zone that very often generates the most interesting ideas. And so I think we have to be very careful about gratifying ourselves too quickly, intellectually or otherwise.
Yeah, it's kind of like being okay with what is, and what is might not always be comfortable, you know?
Yeah, and you might not always have the answer. You might have an apparent contradiction that you can't resolve right away.
Right,
You might be, I was reading a book recently about polarity and about how we live in this black and white world, and we're just so afraid of embracing the gray, the uncertainty in between. But that's where so much beauty lies.
sure. And from a inspirational, motivational point of view, it's like get out of your comfort zone. It's out of that comfort zone that's where the magic happens in your life. I want to talk to you a little bit about this,
Mhm.
your the video and the decision last year. And it's boring on what we're talking about. We talked about how younger generation and even adults are guilty of this too, is that we're looking for gratification outside of ourselves. We're looking to be, the opinions of others matter. You had to kind of put that aside last year, and you opened yourself up to possible ridicule, comments. I read an article in the Toronto Star, and a colleague of yours kind of slammed you.
Kind of. Was it the one about the horse paste?
Yeah, and I wouldn't pass her in my ethics class. That was the line. So you have to open yourself up to this possibility, and a lot of it came to be. What's inside you, Julie, in terms of what's that strength inside you that what sometimes I've got to do it because it's what my heart says.
Mhm. I think a lot of it has to do with fear and how we feel about fear, to be honest. I think probably, I mentioned acrosia earlier, knowing what the right thing to do is and then just not doing it for whatever reason. So I think, what makes me different from someone who maybe just felt, had the same opinion about the mandates that I did, but ended up complying, is that I have a different view about what's fearful, I think, in the world. This is what I've come to realize. I think many people who are inclined to comply feel that ostracization from the group, stigmatization, shaming is the greatest thing to be feared. And I fear what we lose if we hold on too tightly to that fear. So, I mean, some horrible things happened to me. As I said, the worst things. I mean, you've got a lot of them. The worst things are said and continue to be said. It's less intense now, but every so often someone, there's a comment on the review page for my book on Amazon, or there's something on social media about how, oh, she's just just an unreflective, narrative driven anti-vaxxer, something like that. But I think once you are aware of what those comments are, for me anyway, I kind of know that they're there. I know there are people in the world who utter them. I don't think very much of those people, right? I mean, this is the thing, like um, if someone is so unreflective and so cruel that they would call you a name before asking you why you hold the beliefs that you do, then why, I don't feel an inclination to value that person very much, to value their opinions about things, or to view very highly their character. And that isn't to say that there aren't still barbs to their words. It's not to say that it doesn't hurt, but the best analogy I can think of is a kind of ripping off of a Band-Aid. You know it's going to hurt. It does. But then afterwards, there's kind of it starts to go away gradually. And there's a kind of healing. And I think I feel myself like I'm on the other side of it now. And there
Well, just wait, a little loss in
it's
connection.
very freeing. I don't think else. You scrape the bottom of the barrel. Right, so you've hit the bottom of the barrel. The worst has happened, and that is a kind of comforting feeling because you've explored the unknown. And if other people are listening, if you're watching and you're wondering, like, could I do this, I'd say, well, it's not without its cost. But myself, I feel so much better about where I am. And I've met the most interesting, intelligent, kind, curious, dedicated people as a result of doing this. And so, you kind of lose one tribe, but you open yourself up to the possibility of gaining a new one. And I think it's always, often when I'm making a decision, I think, well, what would it look like at the end of life if I had to look back? How would I feel about this? And I think that always towing the line, never doing what you believe to be best, it means that you've not made any kind of personal mark on the world.
Mhm.
And if you die knowing that you never even tried, how empty and meaningless is that going to feel?
Right. And you're not living life on your terms. And I don't mean that from being a sort of a selfish point of view. I heard what you were saying about how people, called you names and an anti this. And I don't even feel like that it's about being anti. It's just I'm making a personal choice that I don't believe in. And I feel strongly about it. That's all it is. It's not about being anti anything. It's just, this is a choice I'm making, and that's it. It's you
Well,
make
and
a choice
what
and
you're talking about, we have the technical term in ethics called integrity. So it's a matter of integrating, right? Literally integrating the various parts of yourself, who you are, what you believe, and then what you say and do. And we know that people who lose integrity, who don't act on the beliefs they have. So in this COVID situation, if you believe that what the government is telling you to do is wrong, but you do it anyway, there are psychological and social cost, even physical costs to that. People who lose integrity, I mean, they lose a sense of self-worth. It's often a strain on their relationships, and it can even have sort of psychosomatic health effects.
sure.
So it's not an insignificant thing just to go with the flow if you believe that the flow is going in the wrong direction.
Right. And then you've got guilt,
Guilt,
shame.
yeah, and remorse, yeah,
Yeah. And
and the guilt of harms to others that you didn't help prevent.
yeah.
You
I personally feel like our leaders and medical community, they're not being real with us on a number of levels. One, of course, is the medical risks associated, and plus the efficacy of the treatment plan, the legal and human rights issues when a workplace can govern medical care. And in my opinion, there's like too many blurred lines. What are you hearing and seeing from your peers and in your work now as compared to last year?
Right. Well, now I work for the Democracy Fund, which is a totally different. I mean, the Democracy Fund was born from basically a reaction to what was going on in many other vocational settings, including academia. And so now, I mean, I work with people who are great at asking questions and are open to questions and love it, and are probably have been shut down in other parts of their lives, but are find it welcoming here. And I mean, I think we've been talking sort of around this, the whole conversation, but we just really live in this culture of silence, and businesses, corporations, educational institutions are all their little microcosmic cultures of silence. And cultures of silence always demonize the whistleblower, the person who wants to shatter that facade, shatter that glass. And again, I think we sometimes need to shatter it. And when we do, we can see more clearly what we have been missing all along.
I was talking with an expert on trauma, especially in the area of men's trauma. And one of the questions I asked him was that for the past 2.5 years, we've gone through a collective trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like maybe that collective trauma is also added to fuel to the fire in terms of what's going on now?
Well, I think one, this is not my area of specialty, but
Right,
the one thing I think we do know about trauma is that it reduces your capacity, your other kinds of psychological capacities, like the
right.
capacity for critical thinking, the capacity for certain kinds of emotions like empathy. So when you have people in a state of trauma, it's not surprising that it would be harder for them to evaluate evidence critically, to see contradictions when they're there, to tolerate dissenting views, to work through a conversation even when there's stress and tension, to sympathize with people who have differences from themselves. So I think we're in a very raw place, morally speaking. We're exhausted, psychologically, but also morally. And we don't have the resources, and we've been worn down over 2 years, and we don't really have the resources we need for moral repair, and to build relationships. We're great at tearing them down. We're great at canceling and ignoring and shutting people down and burning the bridges. But all that stuff is pretty easy. There's a loss involved, but it's easy. We've lost a lot of the skills, I think, and the sense I get from watching threads on social media is that people are just tired. We're kind of building fortresses around the beliefs that we had a couple of years ago, and we would rather build the fortress and then leave the wall undefended than kind of stand by it and talk to the potential invader, right? Pardon the bad metaphor, but I think we need to, I think, calm down a little bit, give ourselves some grace,
Yeah.
some time, probably not make any crucial life-changing decisions. That's what they say, right? When you've had sort of profound states of stress,
Mhm.
just give things a chance to calm down for a little bit, and then, step out of the madding crowd, right? As Hardy said. So we need to kind of, I think we need to just let ourselves to recover and repair ourselves a little bit first before we have the ability to repair our relationships.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with you. Just rest, take a break from it all.
Yeah. Well, a
Personally, I
lot
don't
of
watch the news
people,
anymore.
I'm noticing a lot of people are taking certain kinds of internet breaks, whether it's
Mhm.
social media, what you mentioned, the news, taking breaks from mainstream news. And I think that makes an awful lot of sense. Some people I know are getting burner phones, so they don't have to have access to constant data stimulation. I think making all these choices they require a conscious decision. And so it requires effort and energy. But I think it's the right thing to do at this point. We have to decide, are we going to be passive recipients of data that's coming at us from the world? Or are we going to decide, are we going to create a filter that accepts only certain kinds of information and staves off other kinds and says, that's too much for right now.
Right. And did we forget that we can create our own environment in our own world? Thoughts are
Yeah.
things, or, what are we believing? What are we
Yeah.
thinking about? What are we fed? We're fed like fear, nonstop fear for what, 2.5 years? Well, longer than that, but here are the numbers. Here's this, right?
And we don't have to read those things, or we don't have to read them to excess and indulgence. We can read novels, we can read about history, we can read poetry, we can take up a hobby. And a lot of people are doing this. I mean, it's become such a sort of a meme, almost to the point of being a joke now, but the banana bread baking frenzy
Yeah.
during the pandemic, right? But I think a lot of people did learn a hobby, and now a number of people are choosing to live off grid or homestead or just have a simpler life in some sense that is less dependent on this complicated web of social existence.
Exactly. From a leadership point of view, if you were to wave a magic wand, what do our political leaders, business leaders, media, medical community need to be doing to be more upfront, more real with us? There's been a ton of holding back of information and a ton of misinformation on both sides of the coin, right? On their side, but also on the, I'm gonna, for lack of a better word, the truther side too. There's been a ton of misinformation.
Mhm.
What if you were to wave a magic wand, what needs to happen? What would you like to
I
see?
think this is a complicated issue,
Mhm.
not the least because it's not clear to me that the people we have elected who are in power now have the capacity for what you're talking about. So I think our first step as citizenry is to think more reflectively about what it means to be a leader, what it takes to be a leader, the fact that whatever that is going to look like, it's something more than what someone's hair is like, for goodness sakes.
I know what you're referring to for some reason.
Oh, can't think. But I joke, but I think we sometimes we get very caught up. I mean, the amount of energy and research that goes into figuring out exactly what color of blue shirt a politician should wear and how high it should be rolled up on one's arm in order to have the most successful town hall meeting or meet and greet is very disturbing.
Yeah.
But they do it because it's effective. It's a kind of marketing, right? They're playing to people's desires and sensibilities. And I think that's human nature, I think, to respond to physical appearance and body language and what a person seems like. But we have taken that to a very harmful extreme in society. And, we need to, it's funny to me because so many pro-narrative people will stand vehemently behind our prime minister without asking questions about, well, and to be very clear, I'm not a hardcore credentialist, but I do think that, it's important to ask, well, Justin Trudeau, who is this person? What is his background? What demonstrated successes does he have in life? In his educational background, in his relationships, in terms of public policy? Is this
business economics,
anything? Does he know about anything? And I mean, the Conservative Party in Canada is about to elect a new leader. I certainly hope that people, and some people are voting, they have voted already. I certainly hope that some of these questions are being asked, right? That who is it that has a leadership capacity? What does it take to be the leader of a democracy or a constitutional monarchy? What does it take to do that? And who are we likely to trust? A very simple example that comes to mind right now is I would certainly want to see someone who is willing to question what the media has been doing over the last 2 years and would not expect the media to be a mouthpiece for the government, federal or otherwise.
Yeah, and being literally bought,
Yeah. And if there's no willingness to see and enforce a separation between government and media, that's a red flag in my mind, that in ignoring it will get us to the same place again and again and again.
Yeah. Wow. I do hope we take heart into your magic wand wish on that. So the other thing too that we talked about this a little bit already, just the way people have been treated over the past few years. I find it is completely demoralizing, and to be honest, I'm sick of it. Like I can't even watch anymore. What's your take on the severity of the languaging, the fear, the punishment, the shaming that's happened to all of us these past 18 months?
This is a really good question. I don't quite know the answer to it. I mean, if you look at something like really the unconscionable persecution of Tamara Leach, and you compare that to the comparatively weak punitive response to sex offenders, we have a very odd yardstick, I think, in terms of how we punish people in society today. It's also very unclear, when it comes to someone like her, whether or not she's being punished for what she has done or for what she might do, for the kind of person she is. And it's sending a very clear message that we don't tolerate that kind of citizenship in this country, right? And I don't mean to get off on that tangent too much, but I think it's a very, that situation with Tamara has been an interesting litmus test for what's going on in our government, in our judiciary, in our law enforcement, and in culture. And, just on that note, I've met Tamara personally, and she's not someone who needs to be in prison. She is a grandmother. I saw her
singer.
Yeah, I saw her give a speech that was historically informed. She's very well read. She's soft and kind, and that isn't to say that she's weak. She's far from it, but
Mm,
she's gracious. And this is not someone, I mean, that we should be spending money on incarcerating, and that is not that's the least of our concerns. But it's a sign, I think, that our society is willing to scapegoat without question. And it's very disturbing to me. You go out into the world today and you just watch people going about their lives without any realization that she's still in prison for no good reason, without any realization that people are suffering horrendous physical effects from the COVID inoculations. Children, we have a children's mental health crisis. I mean, there's just harm across the board. And people are talking about, it's so great, the pandemic is over, we can get back to our lives, where are we going to travel next? So there's a kind of like a moral inattention. We're just not paying attention to the right kinds of things. And whether I just think about this a lot. I'm actually writing an essay right now about this, trying to understand it. Is it because we're just exhausted? If you, as a parent, I think at the end of the day, when you've had a little child sort of asking something of you all day, and you're exhausted and demanding, things from you, and you think,
yeah, yes, you
if
can
someone,
have the ice cream.
yeah, if someone knocked at the door and said, I
Yeah.
need your help, I would think, oh, I can't, right? And I just wonder if we're kind of in that position in society generally, where we think, I'm just worn down, I'm raw, I'm beaten, I can't do it anymore. And then in some sense, I think we've also been given permission to treat people badly. Again, in this very juvenile, call someone a name and storm out way. And because nobody's calling us out on it. Right, where our prime minister does it in the house, not
Yeah.
recently, yes, they're on vacation, but he has an altercation with Melissa Lassman. She asks him questions and he leaves. He says horrible things and then he leaves. And the media isn't willing to say what's going on with our with our leader. This is not appropriate behavior. And so it isn't surprising to me that we see language of hatred and contempt and dismissal and dehumanization floating around on social media and people's personal conversations. And I think the buck has to stop with us. You mentioned at the beginning of our conversation about how this can't be a top-down solution because the problem is coming from the top. And that's exactly right. We can't wait for the moral sensibilities of our government and media to change, because either they won't, or if they do, it doesn't count if we just follow their lead anyway. It has to come from us. We have to say, this is enough. We're not going to behave like this anymore. I'm not going to stoop to your level and call you a name just because you did it to me.
Right. Yeah, and I think we definitely then need a healthy dose of courage, like you alluded to after, and we've talked about in your case. Also a healthy dose of self-love, that we're okay no matter what others think of us, and integrity. Like, it's so lacking, to be in integrity, to walk your truth, and your truth is okay. It doesn't have to be my truth, but your truth is okay. I accept you for you living your truth.
And I think you made an interesting point earlier about sort of creating your own beliefs and creating your own little world. And we need to remember that we don't have to live life exactly the way other people live it or tell us we need to live it. We can create our own network of friends, our own support system. We can, to a certain degree, choose the vocation that we, it doesn't have to be something that's popular. We can choose to turn off the technology and spend an evening, whatever we want to do,
Games
gardening,
night, whatever. Yeah.
playing, trivial, whatever it is,
Or coq au vin,
That's right. Well, that'll take a while. That's right.
yeah.
But you can make your reality, as opposed to being a passive experiencer of somebody else's reality. And sure, there's an energy cost to that, but I think only upfront, because it's not draining. It's going to be fulfilling, because it's going to be more you and who you are in an authentic way. And that's always going to be a positive feedback system in terms of energy and vitality and flourishing, rather than a constant drain, which I think is what so many of us are experiencing now.
Yeah. a couple more quick questions. Well, maybe not so quick, but last year was when you did the video, it was an emotional, heart-wrenching experience. How did you find peace in it? How did you find hope in it? And how did
Mm.
life sort of unfold in a way that maybe, man, I'm really surprised, like to where you are today, so.
Well, I don't think I did have peace and hope in the moment. It was a pretty tumultuous
Yes.
thing. And we were also kind of at the beginning of the heavy-handed year of mandates and restrictions on
Yeah.
freedoms. There was
And
so
an
much,
election.
and an election, and that didn't turn out well in my view. And it's so I don't think I had hope and peace at the time. I think I just did it because I thought it was the only thing I could do and live with myself from a conscience point of view. But I think now, which is not to say that the world is a remarkably better place,
Mhm.
but having a little bit of distance from that decision, I do feel peace. And peace, sometimes we I think give peace the wrong, sort of have the wrong impression of peace, which is that it is without challenge or it's without pain. And I don't mean that. I think peace is just a kind of acceptance that what you have done was the right thing to do and you can move forward now. um, Feeling hope about the future is complicated because we are all in this together, in the sense that we have to live a shared existence in some sense with other people. We have to in some sense abide by the laws that are made by a government that people elect in one way or the other, not to get into the intricacies of our government. But it's I do think we are in a period of awakening, gradual though it may be. And I think that humans, and several millennia have showed us this, that humans cycle through the same periods of darkness and light based on our frailties and weaknesses on the one hand, and our capacity to live in a better way on the other hand. I think we've done some pretty terrible things. I don't know if we've hit the bottom in terms of darkness yet. I'm not sure, but I know that it's the nature of human race for there to be people who will always try to bring it out of that period. I know many of them. I know there are many others in Canada and elsewhere in the world that I haven't met. And I know that they are tireless and they're not going to let society die on their watch. I know that. So that's what gives me hope. And you think about our children and what they've been through and what they're going to go through. Decisions are being made right now that are going to severely harm our young and our youngest children. And there isn't anything that you or I can do about that right now in this moment. But we can, I think, make a commitment to every day trying to do a little something to chip away at this machine that's gotten us here.
Yeah. So you feel that we can turn a corner towards a gentler, more loving, accepting society, or is that really a pipe dream?
Yes, but I think it's like, trying to turn a dump truck that has bad steering to begin with around a very tight corner. So
Oh boy, yeah. Or into a parking spot.
Yeah, parallel parking it or something.
Yeah.
It's not an easy task, but
No.
it's a slow burn, I guess I would say.
This has been a delight to meet you. You're an amazing woman. What are you working on next, Dr. Ponesse?
Well, so for the Democracy Fund, I do a series of things each week. I usually record an interview, and then I'm starting to work on a series of essays to accompany those interviews. And I think I've been drawn to doing that because when we have conversations like this, often really interesting things come up that I hadn't necessarily thought of that pique my curiosity. And then writing about it gives me a chance to do a deep dive. So if anybody's interested in that, you can go to the Democracy Fund and you can subscribe and you get a weekly email that has my, the weekly interview plus the essay. And you can subscribe to the Democracy Fund on Twitter and Instagram, and also my personal page, Dr. Julie Ponesse. And yeah, you can see the book.
Yeah, my choice. How did it sell? How did it go?
Yeah, it's going really well, actually. It's very interesting because I sometimes I watch how it's selling, and it tends to ebb and flow with what's going on in the world. So when there isn't much going on, when we're feeling pretty free and safe, sales are really low. And then when something dramatic happens, like I won't name specific events, but when a particular politician says something, or some the Pfizer report comes out and says, oh, I think she was right all along, sales go up. So it's interesting, and maybe there will be more books in the future. I'm not too sure now. It kind of depends on, I think, where we're headed.
Yeah, you wrote that fast. Like,
Mhm.
like I've written a couple, and mine took me a year, so
Yeah.
you
It's
were
a timely subject.
yeah. The website for Democracy Fund is democracyfund.ca, is it?
Yes, thedemocracyfund.ca.
Okay. I really appreciate this today. And stay in
Absolutely.
touch, and keep just, working your magic, and we'll both keep chipping away at things here on the planet.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, David.
My
Have a good
pleasure.
day.
You too. That was Dr. Julie Ponesse. She joined us from her home office in Southwestern Ontario. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll see you very soon.